Bending wood is complicated. Talking about building steam boxes, doing bent laminations, building forms, processing curved components, it can get messy really quickly. But it doesn't have to. So let's talk about 4 bending techniques that you can do in your garage workshop this weekend. So, I just got back from teaching a class in Indiana at Mark Adams School of Woodworking titled Wood Bending Techniques for the Weekend Woodworker. And, you know, if I may pat myself on the back for a moment, I feel like that's a pretty good title. The alliteration, delightful.
I'm kind of a big deal.
But there's a lot of techniques to be learned and utilized in wood bending that we don't talk a lot about on the internet, or it gets kind of brushed aside as just an internet thing, not a thing that professionals do, and that's not really the case. So here's what I want to do today. I want to give you the information I gave to that class because I think it's really valuable information, and I also want to put that information in the context of a professional wood shop because while you guys might be weekend woodworkers, hobbyists, semi-professionals, I think having the context of when and why to use any given technique is really important so that when you come up against a question, a potential reality of like, how am I going to do this thing? You can do it in any number of ways, but what are the techniques that professionals are using in that moment for that project and why? So let's dive in. Now I'm going to give a spoiler right off the top. We are not going to do bent laminations or steam bending in this video because those are the 2 most common ways that we bend wood in the wood shop, and there are innumerable videos on those techniques on the internet already. You can go check those out, but also because they're pretty labor intensive and pretty setup intensive. Doing bent laminations requires table saw, bandsaw, a thicknesser, potentially a drum sander, router table to make forms, while a steam bending requires a big old box, something to make steam. There are simple ways to do it. Don't at me in the comments, but it can get rather intensive rather quickly. So we're going to set those aside and talk about some other techniques that are perfectly legitimate ways to bend wood that we do regularly in the professional shop and that are very accessible to you in your home shops. So let's start with coopering. Now, you might be familiar with coopering as a term related to barrels, because that's where it stems from. People who make barrels are called coopers for a reason, but the technique, whether you're making a barrel or a cooper door, it's the same concept. Essentially, you're taking... I should have a prop. You would think I'd be better at YouTube by now.
Do you realize what you've done?
As I was saying, effectively what you're doing is taking 2 pieces of wood and you're cutting an angle on both of them so that when you glue them up, that creates a little bit of a facet. And then you do that over a number of what's called staves, and you end up with this kind of faceted arc or faceted circle if you get all the way around. And then very simply, what you do is you take said faceted circle or faceted arc and you smooth out the surface to get a nice smooth curve. So let me show you how we do that. Now, the first thing I really want to touch on for coopering is finding the angle. Now, this can get mathy real quick, and that's a technical term. Mathy is for the folks who actually like math. The folks who have a deep-seated fear of math, like myself, I don't know the angle. I just do the old trial and error trick. I know you can calculate it, but don't worry about that if you don't want to. Now, the seams that come off the table saw are good. They're not perfect. So if this was a final piece, if this is a commission, then either I'm going to joint that edge on the jointer or I'm going to take a hand plane to it, make sure that those seams are nice and crisp and beautiful. And then I'm just going to use blue tape or an elastic band if it's a complete circle. But for a simple arc like this,
Regular old blue tape has enough stretch to clamp it tight and create a good solid seam, so don't over-engineer this stage.
So next up, let's talk about our coopering piece. So this, you can make this cooper as large a sweep as you want just by increasing those angles. But the question is, how do you then shape the inside and outside? Well, the outside is very, very simple. All I'm going to do is place this here, and I'm going to take a hand plane to it. And then if this was a piece that I really needed to be precise to it, I might use a shaped card scraper, certainly sand the surface, and that's going to do the job really nicely. The inside, a little bit more of a pain in the butt. There's a lot of different tools that I've made over the years in order to help me with a concave surface like this, such as this bad boy, a shop-made tool I affectionately referred to as Smilin' Sammy. And this is just simply a shaped card scraper in a holder so that I can use this very easily. Now this guy is a little too shallow to do this particular curve. As you can see, I'm not going to bottom out on here. However, what I would do is just shape the other side of the scraper, make a secondary holder with a more aggressive sweep, and then I could shape the interior here very, very easily. I made this for a sculptural table that I did, I want to say like 3 years ago, and it's come in handy a lot for pretty shallow concavities, nailed it, that I need to shape. But, again, this one's a little bit steeper. So it's as simple as taking a little bit of time to make a holder and being able to scrape this. So that said, let's shape the outside.
If you've been watching my work for any amount of time, you are undoubtedly aware of the fact that I hate making jigs. And shaping the outside of a curved component like this, of a coopered component, can call for jig making, depending critically on how many you're making and what your preferred style of working is. Now, I'm going to let this clip play out in real time. This is the full clip of how long it took me to shape the outside of this so you can get a sense of how long it takes to do by hand. But I want to use my buddy Ethan as an example. He's a drum maker, and coopering is a technique that he employs in making his drum kits. And what he does is then takes the coopered shell of the drum and puts it on this rotational wheel and drives it over the router table. So he's smoothing out the outside of the drum in a very efficient manner. Now, he's made 4 or 5 different iterations of this jig, but for him, it makes sense to do that because he's making 1,000 drums in a month, or I don't know what his actual numbers are, but he's making a lot more than one. And I only make one of an object at a time. So for me, making that jig doesn't make a lot of sense. But also, remember that this video is aimed at the weekend woodworker. This class was aimed at the weekend woodworker. And if I were to come into that class and say, hey, coopering is great, but now also you have to do all of this fancy schmancy jig making and buy a router table and do all of these crazy things to get accurate results, well, that would kind of intimidate people and it might scare them away from the process. So just know that all you need to shape the outside of a cooper to a nice smooth round arc is a hand plane and a sander, or maybe even just a sander. And just take your time and work slowly and get those facets removed, and you'll be just fine.
And just like that, we've got a nice continuous curve on the outside here, nice and smooth. That took me all of, 4 minutes? I mean, this is a thing in woodworking that's been used for literally thousands of years, since whenever we started making barrels. So, something to employ in your shop. Now, let's move on to the next one. Look, it's no secret that woodworking is a physically demanding activity. Whether you're doing it 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, or simply on the weekends, it forces you to be more aware of your body and how well it's running. Which is why I try to give my body the nutrients that it needs, including high-quality nutrition supplements like Gruns, the sponsor of this week's video. Gruns are a convenient, comprehensive formula packed into 8 gummies a day. It's not a multivitamin, a greens gummy, or a prebiotic. It's all of those things and then some at a fraction of the cost. 8 gummies are included within each daily snack pack because you can't fit this amount of nutrients into just one gummy. Generic multivitamins only contain around 7 to 9 vitamins. Gruns has 20 plus vitamins and minerals and 60 plus whole food ingredients. Plus, it tastes great. It reminds me of, well, any child of the 80s and 90s knows exactly what it reminds me of, and you know what? I ain't mad at it. Gruns is also more comprehensive and accurately dosed than your current nutrition solution. It contains 100% of your daily needs for safe vitamins and 25% of your daily needs for certain minerals, rather than doses 2 to 3 times that for no reason at all. Plus, Gruns is methylated, which is just fancy science talk for can be absorbed by your body. Did you know that 30 to 40% of people have a gene mutation that makes non-methylated vitamins toxic to them? Because I sure didn't. I don't even know what I just said, because I'm just a good woodworking boy. So get up to 52% off your Gruns order by clicking the link in the description, and thanks to Gruns for sponsoring this week's video. So, coopering is a super useful tool. Employ this in your work. It will make you a better woodworker. But you might be saying to yourself, Eric, this is great. My grain's running along here, but my component needs to do this. It needs to bend along a longer, skinnier, narrower piece. How am I going to make that curve? It's an excellent question. I'm so glad you asked. How do you take a piece of poplar and bend it along its length like that without steam bending or bent laminations? That's a tricky thing. We're going to kerf bend it. Now, this is the one I'm sure you've seen before on the internet. You see somebody take a piece of wood and cut a bunch of grooves in it and bend it around, and you go like, okay, well, that's useful. You can make a bend, but is that really a thing that professional woodworkers do? Is that really a viable technique, or is this just a YouTube hack that you see people doing out there? Here's the truth. This is a thing, maybe not in this particular orientation, but it is a technique that professionals have been using for a long time. So, there's a thing called kerf core, which is essentially plywood with a bunch of kerfs cut in it. And you can bend that plywood over a form and then veneer that plywood, and you get this big curvy surface. There's also a thing called wiggle wood. I don't know if that's the technical industry name for it. Those of us who use it, that's what we call it. I think that's the actual name of the product. But anyway, it's a sheet of flexible veneer with a loose kerf cut core and then another sheet of flexible veneer under it, so you can bend it in all kinds of ways. And then I'm going to build a form, I'm going to tack it to the form, and I'm going to veneer over that. That is no different from this. It's just the industrial version of this. So when you see people doing this technique on the internet, don't think that they're a hack or that they don't know what they're doing. They're just doing the homemade version of what folks in the industry do all the time. To give you some proof of this, think in your head of a upscale office building, in a high rise, and you walk in and there's receptionists at a desk. Think about the desk they're sitting at. Now, these days, they're more rectilinear, they're a bit more geometric because curvilinear forms have kind of fallen out of fashion at the moment. But think back 10 years ago, 20 years ago. You walk into this office, and the thing you see is this big swoopy desk, right? And often, they were veneered in wood. How do you think they got those big swoopy curves? It was kerf core or wiggle wood or kerf bending. So this is a thing that is used. Let's talk about how to do it.
Now, short of jumping into the wiggle woods and the kerf cores of the world, which I highly recommend you check out if you are at all interested, the question that first arises is, how do you figure out where to lay out your kerfs? And you can see on my laptop right there, I've got a little thing on the internet. It's just a kerf calculator, guys. I just Googled kerf calculator. That's all I did, and I used the first one that came up. I didn't even bother to find out if there were better ones on the internet, which I'm sure there are. This is just allowing you to figure out, essentially using the thickness of your blade and how far apart they need to be spaced in order to create the degree of arc that you want. So I wanted a 90-degree angle, and I wanted it to take place over 3 inches, I believe, or maybe that's a 6-inch diameter. And then it just gave me the spacing. That's all it is. And it was somewhere in the range of like 1 1/16. Now, the web, the thickness of the web matters here. So you saw the first one that I did bent perfectly easily, and that web was somewhere around a 16th. The second web was around an 1/8, and it didn't want to make that bend. So what I'm going to do in this case, this is a cheat code you can use, is I'm essentially kind of steaming it in the microwave. So I just ran it over water, threw it in the microwave for 2.5 minutes, and it loosens the fibers up just enough to take that bend. And listen, that's a trick that you can use. Obviously, the scale of your microwave is your limitation there, but if you need to cook that over a steam bath for a few minutes to loosen up that web, that's a thing that you can do. If you need to dunk that in a pot of boiling hot water for a few minutes to get that bend, that's absolutely a thing you can do. Or you can do what I did with the other one, which is just make that web a little bit thinner, and it'll take that bend a little better, and then just glue the damn thing together.
All right, so I've let these sit overnight. This one was just drying in clamps, and you can see that the wet surface of it has, what am I trying to say? The bit that I steamed in the microwave has dried in clamps overnight and has largely taken that form. So gluing this up and clamping them is going to be easy. As a side note, don't get engrossed in a conversation with your shopmate and forget to check every few moments and not let this dry out, because you can light a piece of wood on fire in the microwave. That's a fun fact for you. Safety tips from Eric. I could glue this up now after 24 hours of letting it dry. This one I did glue up yesterday, and you can see it's locked in place. Now there's not a tremendous amount of glue surface at the bottom of these ridges, so what we're going to do is two things. Number one, we're going to veneer this inside face so it locks it together. That's going to create a real locked together surface. Listen, words are hard today. I don't know. The second question that you might be asking yourself is, how are we going to get rid of the facets that exist, the flat spots, from this bending technique? And I'm going to show you exactly how. We're going to shape this, and we're going to get rid of those facets doing it the old-fashioned way. So let's do that.
Now, the old-fashioned version for me is just using a hand plane, because that's how I enjoy working. But if you don't own hand planes, if you don't like hand planes, that's totally fine. You can just use an orbital sander. You can even take it to a belt sander if your web is thick enough. Just be mindful when you're shaping the outside of this curve that the number of facets is determined by the number of kerfs. So the more kerfs you have, the smaller the facets will be, the easier it will be to get to round. We will get there. Words are hard. And the amount of material you have to shape is determined by the thickness of that web. Now, I'm using the iron-on technique, and when I was teaching this class, there were a few folks who were asking if this is really a viable technique to employ in furniture. This is just the contemporary version of hammer veneering. I have no doubt that it will last, and my rule of thumb is, if it's good enough for Craig Thibodeau, it's good enough for me.
So, you might be saying, Eric, that's great. I'm not going to build any big old swoopy entry desks in an apartment complex or an office building. So where am I going to utilize this technique? That's an excellent question. I'm so glad you asked. Early on in my career, when I was making tiny little objects and trying to sell them on the internet, somebody commissioned me to make a speaker box, like a pill box. And it was a stadium shape, flat and then semicircular ends. And the only way that I could think to make this thing was to kerf bend it. So that's what I did. And then I veneered the outside, and it worked beautifully. So if you're making a case piece, this is a fantastic application to put a little bend, a little curve in there, and you can get accurate results if you work more accurately than I did, because you might be able to tell, while it's pretty close to 90 degrees, we're going to call it a saggy 90. Oh, there's a joke in there somewhere that I'm not going to make because the internet. So you can do this accurately. You can work accurately. There are also, for what it's worth, tapered router bits that will allow you to make these kerf cuts without these gaps on the outside. And that's going to give you more glue surface on the interior of that joint as well, so you don't necessarily need to veneer the inside. Just a thought, food for thought. I'm going to leave it there. Let's move on to the next one. Now you might be saying, Eric, that's great. Kerf bending, super dope, but what if I don't want to deal with the facets on the outside here and shaping that up, or having facets on the interior here? How am I going to move away, get the same style of bend, but move away from this kind of web that's on the outside here? Maybe it's not applicable for what I'm doing. Well, let me introduce you to something called the stack lamination. So stack lams have been around for hundreds of years. I don't know quite how many hundreds of years, but at least 200 to 300 years at a minimum, and probably much longer than that. Effectively what it is a brick lay, meaning that you have a seam and then you stack another layer on top of that, but split the seams so that there's no one seam running down the middle. But I've got some poplar here, and I cut some facets, I glue them together, I round over the outside, and then I veneer over it, and you're never gonna be any the wiser that this is made out of poplar and not walnut. I've got a completely veneered version here. So this whole thing, stack laminations, you're never gonna know by the face here. And then you turn around and look at it and you go, oh, well, that's not a smooth curve at all, is it? No, it's not. How do we do that, though? That is an excellent question. Let's talk about it.
So in order to get this done, the first thing I'm going to do is cut my angles. Now, I cut a 5-degree angle. It could have been 7 degrees. It could have been 3 degrees. I didn't do any math. I just trial and error. It looked good. If you want to be more precise and do some calculations, you absolutely can do that. The key here is leaving myself enough width in that board to shape the outside curve, and if you're going to shape the inside, to account for that as well. Now, let's talk about adhesives for a second, because I want to talk about the technique I'm using, and then I want to talk about the historical context of stack laminations. I am using the yellow glue and CA trick to get these miters to go together. Listen, CA glue is too brittle for a lot of applications. I understand it's not ideal, but the strength of this joint is not in the miters, it's in the stack of the laminations here. So all of this right here is long grain to long grain glue contact, and that's gonna lock this thing together. So if there's a little CA glue in the miter, no harm, no foul. Nobody's ever gonna know. It's a lot easier to use that CA glue and yellow glue trick than it is to develop a clamping system for every one of those miters if it's not an enclosed circle. Now, why did they use stack laminations in the past rather than bent laminations? Well, for a long time, the best glue we had was hide glue. And hide glue is a great glue, don't get me wrong, I'm not knocking it, but it doesn't do bent laminations very well. It doesn't handle that stress very well. And when it gets moist, when it gets wet, and it starts to soften, those laminations could delaminate. So a more reliable way to go about this to create these curved front aprons was to do a stack lamination and then simply veneer the outside edge. So that way you only have one lamination or one veneer that is under tension rather than the entire apron delaminating and blowing the table up. So that's why it was used in the past. And where does this get used today? It gets used in lots of places, including but not limited to, again, coming back to my buddy Ethan, using stack laminations to create drums. Now, I want to say this up front. I don't know that much about drum making, but I do know that drums are periodically made using stack lams.
Now that is about as simple as it gets. This is a technique, guys, I cannot stress this enough. This is a technique that has been around for hundreds of years. This is not cheating in any way. This is a very traditional way to build things like a bomb chest or a curved apron on a demi-lune table or a card table of some kind. This stacking and curving technique and then veneering over the top has been around for eons. So employ it. It's super, super simple. Now, where does this technique get applied in contemporary furniture? So not too many people are making bomb chests these days, though they do get made. So where might you use this? Well, take a look at some recent sculptural furniture. Now, depending on how you define recent, but let's go as far back as, say, Wendell Castle, who is a big name in the furniture design world. If you don't know him, look him up and get familiar with his work. But he often employed stack lamination and often used ash and then painted it black so you still had the grain lines in there, and then just carved away all of the waste. So you get these big, weird sculptural forms made out of wood, but you don't have any of the short grain issues that might arise from carving out of a solid chunk. That is an option. We veneered over it today because we were being traditionalists, but don't be afraid to employ this in any number of other ways. Now, onward. Last but certainly not least, we're going to dive into a technique that I find a tremendous amount of fun to use and play with. And my shopmate, I think, has kind of made a little bit internet famous. So let's dive into hot pipe bending. Now here's the thing. Larissa will be the first person to tell you she didn't invent hot pipe bending. I learned about hot pipe bending a decade before I met Larissa, and I always do check in with her because it's become one of her things that she's known for. So I always do check in with her before I make a project that is very clearly influenced by our friendship and my proximity to her work. But she always does remind me, hey, I didn't invent it, so like, just do the thing. Just do the thing. Now, hot pipe bending is a variation on steam bending, so I do just want to point that out. I said no steam bending, and we're not breaking out the steam box, but we are introducing moisture and heat to an element of wood in order to help it bend, so that's what we're going to do. Now, hot pipe bending requires, you probably guessed it by now, a pipe that's hot. So we're going to get a piece of steel, we're going to get some strips of wood, we're going to heat up said steel with a torch, and we're going to bend these little pieces freeform, willy-nilly, without a care in the world around said steel pipe. So let's do that.
Now, among the key differences between Larissa and myself is the fact that she's a jig queen. She made this jig for this specific setup because she teaches this class often enough, and it makes it easier to set up in a classroom setting. So it doesn't have to be that fancy, that complicated. The key component is that the flame is hitting the pipe, and the pipe is hot enough when you see the water dance right off of the edge of the pipe there rather than evaporate right away. And then it's just a process of taking your time. You can feel the fibers of the wood start to give way when they're heated up enough to bend. And then you just keep dipping it and keep moving it. And it's back and forth. It's this dance. And you can play with it as much as you want. You have to be mindful of two things. Number one, the pipe is very hot. So don't, guys, I'm going to say it now. Don't touch the pipe. Wear gloves if you feel more comfortable wearing gloves, but don't touch the pipe. And also, you see me standing to the side. Don't stand directly in front of the pipe because all of the heat coming from the torch, guess where that heat is going? Out the front of the pipe. So don't burn yourself, but take your time and let the wood bend. You can start to get a feel for how the thing wants to move. And once you just get some random shapes, clamp them together and let them dry for a little while so that they can retain most of that shape. Sometimes I'll let them dry for a few hours. Ideally, I would let them dry overnight, but I'm an impatient man, so here we are.
So, using this technique, it's inevitable that you will get some breaks. It's just going to happen. So, you don't need to throw that whole piece out. What you can do is just break it where the fiber's crushed, and now you have little bitty boys. Like this loop right here, I still got 3/4 of a full loop, and I can just break that little guy off, and now I can use this as part of a composition. And this is the fun part of this technique, is when I start pulling things and I just get to like put things together and see how they go together in ways that are interesting and unique, and just see what kind of thing I can get, what kind of interesting weirdness. Maybe that's a little too voluminous right there. I think, yeah, so if I cut that off up top, had that be the tall guy, cut this one over here, and then I have this kind of, that kind of thing. But none of it matters. Again, this is the fun part of it, where it's just like, I don't know, what looks good? What works? What's speaking to me? Can I put this in here in lieu of something, or does it go this way? I really want it to do that, but it doesn't, so it's not going to. What if I flipped these two around? There's no wrong answer. Oh, that could work. That could work. Yeah. Anyway, the point is this. You play around with this composition until you get something you like. You glue these together, and then you put them through a lid, sand them down, shape the ends, and you end up with something like this. It is a very simple, very loosey-goosey process that can be a ton of fun once you figure out how this process works and you get comfortable with it. Now, what I enjoy most about this technique is there's no right or wrong answer. It's just play, right? So I take a bunch of pieces, I organize them up, I try to create something interesting, and the form should feel balanced. That's my hope, at least. And now what I'm going to do is, I really like this composition, so I'm going to let this set for about 24 hours, and then I'm just going to start cutting pieces and shaping them and sanding them, getting rid of any burn marks that exist. I'll glue this together, and this will become something. I feel like maybe I'll make a little tiny vase and put this in here just as like a standalone sculptural object. That could be really fun, but you can, of course, put a little tenon on here and make it the top of a box, as Larissa has been doing for many years. So this is really, it's just a plaything, you know? Go in, have fun. Make sure you don't burn yourself on the pipe. I'm going to say that now before somebody hits me with the comments in a year from now, mad at me because I didn't warn them that the pipe was hot. So don't burn yourself. But just go have fun with it. It's a thing you can do. Open the windows, let the fresh air in, and take your mind off of the worries of the world and just make these stupid little forms because it puts a smile on your face. Well, friends, there you go. None of these techniques are super advanced. They can become super advanced, but these are the basics of how they work, and they can be applied in your shop, in your garage workshop, in your basement workshop, whatever your setting is. You can do these techniques with really nothing more than a couple of basic woodworking machines. So I hope this was helpful, and I encourage you to explore these things, because once you start doing some things like stack lams or kerf cutting or hot pipe bending, like, you can get into some really fun things very, very quickly. So I'm going to get out of here while the getting's good, and I'm going to take this and turn it into a little sculptural moment for my partner, and try to make something with that on the video that Larissa and I are putting out hopefully soon. Hopefully. But until then, friends, go make a thing, go try to enjoy it if you can, and I will see you all in the next video.